Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. My name is Forrest Inslee, and in this episode, we'll be talking to Timothy A. Wise, author of Eating Tomorrow, Agriculture, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. Now, recently I interviewed a guest on this show representing the African Green Revolution Forum, an entity that promotes large-scale agriculture involving multinational companies as the key to Africa's economic development. In response to that interview, listeners to this podcast asked if we could present an alternative view that might help us to understand the risks and challenges of the AGRF approach. So, in the interest of fairness and seeing issues from all perspectives, I've invited Timothy Wise to that end. He argues that the key to a more sustainable, earth-friendly mode of development is not industrial agriculture, which he explains does much to harm the environment and disrupts local cultures. Rather, in his view, we need to be supporting the work of small farmers whose local knowledge and relationship to the land actually helps them to farm in ways that promote environmental health and produce food that's better for us. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Tim, I'm going to ask you to talk to us about what it is that you do day to day. What are the things that you're invested in?
I like to say that the book that I wrote, Eating Tomorrow, which came out at the beginning of 2019, was really a perfect culmination of what I've had as sort of three careers. I like to think of them as. I started out working in economic journalism for a magazine called Dollars and Cents Magazine. I then I was the director of an aid organization called Grassroots International, which did on-the-ground international partnerships for development with community-based groups. And then since about 2000, I was a researcher doing policy research in an academic setting at the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. I'm still affiliated with that program, though I now work for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, based in Minneapolis, as a senior advisor working remotely. What I'm most invested in is trying to communicate to a U.S. and international audience the realities of small-scale farmers and their struggles, their needs, their aspirations, and the many, many, many ways in which international development goes wrong in trying to address those. The book kind of goes in much greater detail, very much where the subtitle of the book would make you think. It's called Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. And so I'm very concerned with the excessive economic power and political influence of large-scale agribusiness firms in determining those development programs and pathways that end up often serving developing country farmers so badly.
So we're actually going to link to your book in the show notes for those listeners who are interested in the book, and I do highly recommend the book. For our listeners, Tim, I'm wondering if you could tell us sort of the essence of your message in that book and really where the vision for the book came from in the first place.
Yeah, the vision for the book really came from my desire to make sense of what on its face was a very positive shift in development thinking that came out of the 2007 and 8 came to be known as the food crisis, where prices spiked. There were shortages in different parts of the world, but it provoked a sudden recognition that developing countries needed to grow more of their own food. And the people who needed to do that were the people who were growing it already, small-scale farmers. That was a big shift, from what's been called neoliberalism, but it's sort of the latest version of free market capitalism, free market fundamentalism, some call it, where the powers that be, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, USAID, and others were really recommending that governments get out of the way and let the market determine who grows what. That's been a huge failure for small-scale farmers and for food security in developing countries. This was a shift. And so I wanted to find out that if that was the commitment that was now being voiced at international forums and elsewhere, why wasn't it happening? Why weren't policies shifting to favor the empowerment of small-scale farmers to grow more of their country's food in ways that made sense, that were sustainable, that were affordable? So that was the real motivation for the book. And I decided to travel, not the world, because I only had a year, turned into 3 years to do the research. I concentrated on Southern Africa because Africa is really where the urgency of the food crisis and the need for this kind of transformation is the greatest. But I also went to Mexico, where I'd done a lot of research to look at the different ways these policies have played out. I went to India, largest hungry population in the world, and one that's sort of a battleground between small farmers and agribusiness. And then I went to the heartland. I went to Iowa and looked at kind of where did this agricultural model come from and how's it working in Iowa? Not well. And why are we exporting it then to the rest of the world if this model is so flawed in Iowa? I think the main message of the book is captured in the title, that we are not quite literally eating our collective tomorrows by promoting industrial agricultural systems that are undermining the natural resource base on which future food production depends. We're doing that here in Iowa, and we're trying to push continents like Africa onto that same path, and we do so at great peril. In the process, we are ignoring the many creative and effective solutions to climate change, to food insecurity, to poverty, to the need for a greater variety of nutritious foods, models offered up by small-scale farmers themselves. And why do we keep ignoring affordable local solutions in favor of these agribusiness-driven, large-scale industrial agriculture projects?
So clearly in your research, you found the answer to that question. Why?
There's obviously no one why, but there is a thread that ran through the book in surprising ways to me. Just the astonishing influence of agribusiness, not just economically, but politically in policy formation. They want Malawi, for example, to have seed policies that protect the intellectual property of those who develop new seeds. But what they really want is to open markets for their seeds, for seeds developed by multinational crop breeders, Monsanto among them, to sell in Malawi. And to do that, they need to convince or coerce farmers into no longer saving the seeds that they currently use so that they will enter the market for buying seeds every year. I actually uncovered the fact in the course of my research that a former Monsanto country director was one of the authors of the seed policy that was being promoted by the Gates Foundation and others that would have made it more difficult, if not illegal, for them to save, exchange, and sell their seeds that they get from their crops every year.
These days, you hear a lot of rhetoric that tends to demonize, that paints companies like Monsanto, for example, as, essentially evil and out to get people, in a nefarious sort of way. But I find that way of thinking and speaking just a bit reductive. And I personally think it has a lot to do with systems that have been put into place, cultural systems, economic systems that kind of run us rather than us running them. You know what I'm talking about? It kind of takes away some of that demonization because it's less about intention and more about the power of systems that are kind of running and almost unstoppable.
No, I think that nuance is really important. I mean, there are things that companies do, companies like Monsanto, they actively distort science, and distorting science, they corrupt regulatory processes that should serve the purpose of making sure that the products that we're consuming are safe. The much larger question is, why do our regulatory processes allow that? Why are they so flawed that there's no independent check on what impact a particular product, seed, or whatever is going to have on people, on the environment, not just in the short term, but in the long term, and actually socially on the quality of life of farmers in rural communities. And those processes have been so corrupted at this point by this ethos of the influx of money into politics that no one should be surprised that the companies are trying to make more money. That's what they were founded to do. Nobody should be surprised that they want to make laws that make it easier for them to make more money.
It comes down to values, doesn't it? I mean, if your value puts highest priority on profit, for example, then of course you're going to end up with policies like these. I mean, it's not a necessary, a given, but as you say, it should be no surprise that that's where we end up.
I'll perhaps challenge some notions about it being based in values in the sense that the U.S. is one of the most beholden to the idea of corporate social responsibility. And of course, we all think that everyone should have social responsibility, including corporations. We're one of the only places that I've traveled where it's kind of an ethos that that's the way we're going to make sure that corporate desires to increase their revenues and profits don't come at the expense of the public interest. Most people everywhere else recognize that those two interests are actually not consistent with each other, and that companies recognize that those interests are not consistent with each other, and they therefore allow for serious regulatory processes that are not dominated by industry influence and money, that allow proper regulation to protect the environment, to protect human health, to protect competitive markets. It's not a good thing if companies get too big and dominate markets. It's not good for anybody. I think what's really needed is something that goes far more to the heart of recognizing that, of course, we want everybody to have social responsibility, but we need robust laws and regulatory processes that ensure that private actors who are chartered to make money aren't making money at the expense of public health and the public interest.
So your book is very readable, and it's clearly meant to make the information you're presenting accessible. And I'm wondering if you could comment on your idea of who the audience is for your book, and maybe more importantly, how you hope that readers will be impacted by the things that you're writing about.
I came last to academia, and I consider myself in some ways least an academic researcher and most an economic journalist. And so I really believe in the power of storytelling, the power of first person. So I really hoped to take the reader out into the world with me as I tried to sort out what's going on here. I think a lot of readers and potential readers would share the kind of nonsensical, almost common sense understanding that if we want more poor farmers to be able to eat better, we should help them grow more food. And we shouldn't undermine the resource base that sustains that food production in the long run. So why aren't we doing that? Is a very, popular notion and common sense question that I wanted to take people out into the world with me to see how that was playing out and what's undermining those goals, and also what's exemplifying those very basic principles, which I saw a lot of everywhere I went. So I guess I'd say that what the world of international development is a black box for a lot of people, but it's kind of straightforward too. And so I'm a firm believer that good perceptive writers can make things accessible to complicated things accessible to a broad array of people. And I hope I've done that with the book.
I guess the corollary question then is, once people understand the things that you are trying to shed light on, what's the so what part? I mean, what can people actually do about those things? How can they live differently? How can they take action? If they recognize the problems that you're describing as serious issues, is there something that people can actually do to make a difference?
I think climate change is a catalyst here. And I think more and more even just compared to just 4 years ago. People in the United States, including farmers in places like Iowa, are more acutely aware that climate change isn't a future threat, it's a present danger. And the present danger has huge implications for agriculture. Overseas, Southern Africa is already one of the most hard hit by the changing climate, droughts, extreme weather events like floods, more extreme storms like cyclones, like we saw in Mozambique. All policies are going to have to be climate proof. They're going to need to be climate resilient. They need to promote climate resilience. And what we're doing is not doing that. The policies we're promoting overseas isn't doing that. And so I think there's a real opportunity for it. It leads to a whole interesting set of changes that are being proposed for U.S. agriculture, quite apart from international development assistance.
I do actually want to talk about that. And I'm intrigued with your use of the word catalyst. By that, I think what I hear you saying is that because of the experiential awareness of climate issues and changes, that opens up people in a way that they might not otherwise be open to the necessity of change. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Perhaps also just the desirability of change, in the sense that, farmers in Iowa have lost 50% of their topsoil over the industrial agriculture era. Everyone knows the practices that lead to soil loss. Everyone knows that the practices that could stop it would sequester carbon in the soil, so there'd be a carbon benefit for which there is no price. There's no value to that assigned by the market. So it would have to come from some sort of regulation or government program that makes that a valuable thing. It's good for farmers in the long run. Farmers live in the short run because they're fighting to try to make a profit year to year. And these aren't changes that individual farmers can easily make themselves. They're system changes. So you need a critical mass of support and acceptance from a broader range of actors and stakeholders. And I'm seeing that whether the mass is critical yet or not, it's growing. And that's for things like regenerative agriculture, things like, it goes by a lot of names: climate resilient agriculture, carbon sequestering agriculture, that kind of puts the environment and the long-term health of the environment first, but can have very clear benefits for farmers themselves and for communities.
I am wondering if you could help listeners to really clearly see the contrast between these two different ways of thinking about agriculture and development. On the one hand, you have industrial agriculture, and on the other, this approach that could go by a number of names, but really is on the opposite end of the spectrum. Could you actually describe for us those two different approaches? But as you do in your book, perhaps tell us some of the stories of the farmers that you have seen in your world travels that will help us to understand how those two approaches actually contrast with one another.
I don't know, one of the most inspiring stories or communities I got to know in the course of my research was in Malawi. Malawi is a small landlocked country in southern Africa, on the eastern side of southern Africa. It's actually the country in the world that consumes the most maize, corn, per capita in the world, more even than Guatemala or Mexico. A surprise to me. It's the staple food, and the country is overwhelmingly dominated by small-scale farmers. It's still an overwhelmingly agricultural country, and the farms are relatively small. So here you have where smallholder-based development is what's needed. And the government is doing, with the support of donors, is promoting the Green Revolution. Green Revolution being defined as Africa's version of the programs that are given far too much credit for having saved lives in India, but did so by promoting the use of modern seed varieties fed by inorganic fertilizer. That's the program that the Green Revolution for Africa is trying to put in place, and that's the program that is supported by subsidies the Malawi government gives to farmers, coupons that give them huge discounts on the purchase of those seeds and those fertilizers. What I found when I went there was that they had definitely increased the amount of corn they grew overall, nationally, but that farmers really weren't much better off. And that was because even with the subsidies, production didn't go up that much with new seeds and fertilizers. Farmers still were very poor and they couldn't afford enough fertilizer to really feed these crops. And the cost was higher than the benefit. So they weren't producing enough to sell in the market and get a good price for it. And the price they could get wouldn't pay for the fertilizers and other inputs they needed to buy. So it was a losing economic proposition. Farmers in central Malawi that I got to know pretty well in an area called Lobi pretty much rejected that project. And they started what they called the farmer-to-farmer agroecology program. And what that was with the help of researchers from the university. The nutritionists came because they saw the desperate need for more diverse diets because people were just eating corn, and corn is a fine source of carbohydrates and it doesn't give you much else. So you need a more diverse diet. And they were seeing these crop diversity go away as people just grew more and more corn and grew less and less of other crops. So it was a crop diversity to achieve nutritional diversity. And they had, in 3 years, they had farmers improving their soils, intercropping, growing in the same field at the same time, different crops, which is one way to produce soil health, but also to produce climate resilience. Because if a drought comes and kills one of the crops, the other crop doesn't die. So the crop diversity had exploded in the region. It was not being fed with synthetic fertilizers. It was being fed with compost that they were making in the community themselves. They were seeing their soil quality go up dramatically. The soil quality goes up, the yields go up, so they were getting really good production. Their diets improved dramatically as the crop diversity increased. The thing that made the project particularly compelling was that in that community, they had also discovered an incredibly nutritious variety of corn that grew native to the region, bright orange corn, very high in vitamin A and other nutrients. And vitamin A is a huge deficiency in a lot of parts of the developing world. So vitamin A is something that development agencies are desperate to get. They're marketing a biofortified vitamin A enriched maize variety in Malawi at the same time. But nutritionists proved that this was actually more nutritious, this local variety, and it was free. You could save the seeds year after year. You never had to buy more seeds. There were development agencies who wanted to buy the seeds from them to start using in other communities in Malawi to try to increase this. And again, this is where the contradictions come full circle. The new seed policy in Malawi, drafted first by the head of Monsanto there, threatened to make it illegal for them to sell those seeds to those development agencies because it would pose a threat in some ways to the future markets of those selling maize seeds in Malawi, Monsanto being the biggest seller in that particular country.
In the meantime, though, this coalition of farmers in central Malawi does get to remain independent, right? I mean, they can continue to save their seeds, exchange their seeds. It's just about the broader distribution that they're limited in?
Well, the first draft of that seed policy, and some of the seed policies being promoted by the Gates Foundation and others, are more restrictive than that. It actually would threaten the exchange of seeds between farmers. The first draft, I mean, this is a little hard to believe. I find that when I say this, people don't believe it. But the first draft of that seed policy said that it would be illegal to call their maize seeds, that they could only call them grain, meaning worthy of eating, but not of planting, because the word seed was heretofore on into the future only to be used to refer to a seed that had been certified by the government as being seed-worthy. That flies in the face of 80% of the food grown in Africa is grown with saved seed. So you're essentially saying that 80% of the food being produced in Africa is being produced from something that's actually not a seed. One of the farmers who grew this orange maize in central Malawi heard about this policy, and he said, he holds up a little kernel of bright orange maize and says, "We've been growing this in my community for generations. How can this not be a seed?" That's kind of the problem in a nutshell, right? Mm-hmm. You ask about the two different development approaches, the two different world visions of the future. There you have it. And it gets to extremes.
Earthkeepers podcast seeks to highlight diverse experiences from all walks of life and from different cultures. In fact, we have listeners from 5 different continents, and our reach continues to expand. Here's Jason Lyle from Georgia talking about his work with sustainable development in Uganda.
This is Jason Lyle with 1015 Foundation. I enjoy listening to Earthkeepers. Forrest is a wonderful host. He was gracious enough to have me on to talk about environmental issues and living in the South. It's a vital part of what we do in the development world, be it caring for the environment, but also caring for each other in those symbiotic relationships. I work extensively in Uganda, creating sustainable economic growth, and Earthkeepers is a very valuable part of my work because it keeps me sharp, makes me think, and as I said, especially coming from the South, I have to do that in every way I can. So anyhow, yeah, keep up the good work.
We invite you to share your thoughts or questions with the rest of the Earthkeepers community by leaving a short voice message on our website. If you are one of the first 2 people who leave us a message this week, we'll send you a free copy of Hannah Anderson's awesome new book, Turning of Days, Lessons from Nature, Season, and Spirit. And on that note, let's get back to our conversation with Timothy Weiss. How do you go back from something so monolithic and dominant? I mean, I have hope for Africa, right? I mean, because we can resist still, and we have 80% of the people still saving seeds and growing from saved seeds. But what do you do with Iowa?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, I met some people in Iowa who have answers to that question. You know, they're very clear, as you are, that it's not going to look like Malawi. It's not going to look like a bunch of small farms saving seeds and growing ecologically, right? Yeah, one of the most interesting people I talked to in Iowa is a guy named Matt Liebman, who's an ecologist at Iowa State University. And he's had this long-running experimental farm for research where he plants a standard corn and soybean rotation, this standard farm that's you see all over Iowa. And then he has experimental versions of that in which he's trying different things and testing different things. He showed that by simply adding a rotation of grass, alfalfa, to the 2 rotations, so you add a 3rd rotation of crops, and it's grass, which is a perennial, has deep roots, adds nitrogen to the soil, doesn't deplete it, et cetera, et cetera. He documented an 85% decrease in fertilizer use on the farm, a 97% decrease in herbicide use on the farm, a complete elimination of water pollution from nutrient runoff, a complete elimination of soil erosion, because those deep roots hold the soil in place, and our restoration of soil fertility over time, building soil fertility over time, all while maintaining the productivity and profitability of the farm enterprise. And I said to him, when he took me to his farm and showed me this and described the results, I said to him, well, Matt, that is the win-win-win solution that everybody is dreaming of, right? How many farmers are using this? And he said, almost none. And I said, why? And he said, well, I think I have the quote right in my head. I couldn't have developed a program that more directly impacted agribusiness interests in the state. And so all you have to do is think about it. And this is a really good exercise. I would encourage any listeners of this podcast to actually think about this when you think about why aren't we doing something that seems like it's so obviously good? The question to ask is, who would lose money if you did it? So do you think Monsanto is going to be excited about a 97% decrease in herbicide sales? No. Would Koch Industries, one of the main fertilizer sellers there, be happy about an 85% drop in fertilizer sales? No. If you take a third of your land out of corn and soybeans, are the seed sellers like Monsanto and Pioneer and others going to be happy about a drop in seed sales? No. It goes deeper than that. On the output side, who are the consumers of those corn and soybeans? The livestock firms, Smithfield and Tyson. If you plant less corn and soybeans, the prices are going to go up, as they should, because they've been punishingly low for farmers. But they don't want to see higher costs for their feed. So they're opposed to those policies. And they wield so much influence at the state level, those firms, that it's very, very difficult to get the kind of broad systemic change to happen, changes in policies and programs that would allow individual farmers, give them even just the markets for the products that they would need to have to be able to make that change. Some farmers go ahead and do it anyway. Those are the kinds of proposals that come out of those advocating regenerative agriculture. You put cover crops down, so it's not that complicated to tweak the industrial model of agriculture so that it has way fewer of the negative environmental impacts. And in that process, it cuts into the power of agribusiness over those economies and those decisions and increases the power of farmers in those decisions. And then you have a lot more free rein to explore alternatives that certainly will not make Iowa agriculture look like Malawi, but it could make it look a whole lot more sustainable.
I think what I love about your stories here is the implications are ironic that, while I think the American mindset is oriented toward, we share our knowledge and expertise with the world, even though that is how we think and certainly how a lot of developers think, we would stand to learn a lot if we were humble enough to listen to Malawi, to actually understand the power and potential of what is there, not just as new models, but as models that have actually been in place for long enough to be proven that we could actually be changed by the very people that we are oriented to think we need to change.
I think that's a very good observation. I wrote a piece actually after the cyclone that wreaked havoc on Mozambique in southern Africa. I guess that was in 2019. I was in Iowa the next spring talking about my book at the same time that Iowa had just suffered massive flooding from its own bomb cyclone. And I wrote something that basically said, look, we're all in the same lifeboat now, and we better listen to each other. And what the Mozambicans who I've talked to and who do some of the most climate resilient farming I'd seen there, similar to what I saw in Malawi, would tell you in diversity, there is strength. Crop diversity is absolutely critical to soil health and climate resilience. And looking at Iowa, you guys need more crop diversity.
Well, in that sense, cultural diversity is essential as well, because again, we have to be able to see from perspectives that we aren't able to generate necessarily in and of ourselves.
No, that's right. There's a very good, interesting institute founded by the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, really inspiring leader in that position. He left the position in 2014, I think it was, and started an institute called the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, APACE Food. Wrote a great report called From Uniformity to Diversity. And it's essentially how the world needs to shift from this overly uniform idea of what agriculture and farming needs to do to recognizing the value of diversity on every level within the soil, microbes, diversity culturally, diversity of different types of food systems, that's all good. I quote Vandana Shiva, the Indian farm leader and campaigner, wrote a great essay that I thought of everywhere I went writing this book called Monocultures of the Mind, about how Western science locks us into this very narrowed idea of Western science that analyzes problems only in their component parts, but not as systems, and leads to, one gene that will combat drought will make that maize plant climate resilient. It's like, no, it won't. And Malawi told me we need drought-resistant farms, not drought-resistant seeds. It's like the entire system needs to be engineered and maintained and stewarded in a way that creates that kind of resilience.
So I live in the home of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. And of course, we see him and we see the organization in a kind of heroic way. We love what they do for the most part, especially because they do so much actually for the Pacific Northwest and Seattle in particular. However, clearly they're backing some development modes that, as you are pointing out, are of questionable value, but may even actually be damaging the earth and damaging cultures and damaging communities. Do you think there is any hope for agencies like the Gates Foundation in terms of helping them to come around and to see these different ways? I mean, why is it that they're so invested, say, in the industrial model of agriculture?
That's probably the most common question I've gotten asked at any of the book talks that I give. Has Bill Gates seen this book? Because everyone feels like he's, he and Melinda are big-hearted people with big pockets and deep pockets, and that they're generous with what they have in those deep pockets. A companion at one of these book talks I gave had a lot more history with the Gates Foundation than I did, and he had a very, I thought, useful framework for understanding that problem. He said, it's really probably not reasonable to think that someone who made their money as a technology monopolist, it's unreasonable to think he's going to look for solutions that aren't based on large companies and technology. I think that's the inherent bias in the Gates Foundation's approach. It's really inappropriate technology in a lot of parts of the world. And that's what I saw with the Green Revolution in Africa, that they heavily support. I mean, they support a lot of other things too in Africa, but that's their biggest grantee there by far. And I think it's just blind faith on their part. And blinders is a good way to think about it on the actual real life conditions of the farmers that they're working with, that those are supposed to help, and the actual impacts that those programs have on them.
If your goal is to solve big problems on systemic levels, then there's going to be something very attractive about a solution that claims to solve problems in very big ways. And those kinds of solutions don't always lend themselves, as you say, to paying attention to families and communities and even cultures.
I think that's right. And I think the difficulty for those of us who would like to see them shift gears, shift their focus, I mean, they would claim to be very results-oriented, like we do what works kind of thing. We test what works and then we do what works. I just did this report last year on the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, showing that it really was not having much impact, positive impact at all. It was decreasing crop diversity. It wasn't really stimulating a productivity revolution. Incomes for farmers weren't really going up. Hunger was actually on the rise, not going down. This is 14 years of an initiative of the Gates Foundation. So it's not like this should be news that these results are happening. But the most alarming thing about that program wasn't the results to me. It was that there are no published evaluations by the Gates Foundation or by AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, that kind of show that they're having an impact. So you get the feeling that they're just saying, we know this is the right way to do it. We don't even have to document that it's working. And they don't. And for something that is spending $1 billion in 14 years in 13 different countries in Africa, for there not to be a serious evaluation against their top line goals, at least with their beneficiaries, they're having that kind of impact. I mean, I think it speaks to where we started out, private interests carrying out private programs without public accountability. This is a lot of money. The downside of something like the Gates Foundation is they're accountable to their 3 trustees, Bill, Melinda, and Warren Buffett. That's not enough. They're involved in so many issues that are so many problems and solutions that are of the public interest that I think they need to be more publicly accountable because they're such a big player and they drive investment and public policy. And they're active about it, right? They want to drive public policy, which in some ways is a good thing, right? You want influential people to influence things in a good way, like vaccinate children. Good. Yes, but it's a different thing when you're pushing somewhat narrow and controversial programs like the Green Revolution programs.
Well, speaking of the AGRA, we have had a guest from the Associated African Green Revolution Forum, and I wonder if you could comment on the AGRF. The guest that we had on was quite high up in leadership, and he was very excited about what was happening. He was, it seemed, most excited about the fact that people from Africa all over the continent were coming together to try to dream together, to try to find strategies forward that would increase the prosperity of Africa. And he too spoke about farmers. He talked about promoting the infrastructure that would then enable local farmers to move their crops and transport them and sell them for better prices, et cetera. So I'm wondering if you could talk maybe first about what you see as the good things that AGRF is doing, but then also talk about your disagreement with them. What's the sort of the core issues that maybe they need to rethink?
What you describe as his enthusiasm is, I think, a really needed process. The existence of such a forum is in and of itself a good thing. It piggybacks on a lot of really positive organizing that's gone on in Africa among African governments and private sector companies and non-governmental organizations to some extent that resulted in some continent-wide commitments to raise agricultural investment of government resources in agricultural development because that had languished. Really important to do that. That raised, kind of set a series of targets that African governments agreed to be measured against on progress toward a set of indicators for agricultural development. And again, really positive to have that kind of framework. The international community came in and backed that with some serious research muscle so that where data systems weren't in place to really document how well this was going, researchers could supplement that and provide an analytical framework for it. I mean, I see the AGRF, that same larger set of processes that through the African Union and other regional bodies are trying to shine a light on agriculture and on food systems and on what governments need to do to make them more productive, efficient, fair. The downside is that there's a ready-made formula for telling these governments what they should do with all that money. We're going to give you some money. We want you to devote a lot more of your own money. And here's what that money should go for. That's been a misguided investment. More on the part of African governments, which spend, AGRA has spent, we calculated for this report that AGRA has spent $1 billion in its 14-year history. African governments spend $1 billion every year subsidizing fertilizer and seeds so that farmers can afford to even consider using these inputs that are otherwise out of their reach. The fact that you have to subsidize all the inputs should be an indication that it's not a very sustainable program. So my main critique of AGRF is that it's not, there's a lot that happens at those things. As someone who interviewed me and came out in a critical article in the Kenyan press, an interview with me, I think they actually asked me, what would you have the Green Revolution Forum do? And I think I said something like, to do anything good, it'd have to change its name. Like African Development Forum, great. African Agricultural Development Forum, great. But if your title has presumed the answer to your development question, it's too narrow a definition.
Let me ask you about the issues that actually our listeners care a lot about, which are environmental issues. And you obviously advocate for social justice and economic justice, and also environmental justice in the sense that you see the regenerative agriculture, for example, as a means to not just stop the damage, but even heal the earth. I'm wondering if you could describe that constellation of interests. Like, what does environmental justice have to do with caring for people, with human flourishing?
Well, everything, right? Absolutely everything. As I described initially, the main finding of the book is that we are eating our collective tomorrows by undermining the natural resource base on which future food production depends. That's real. That's in Iowa, that's in Malawi, that's in Mozambique, that's in India, that's everywhere. It's alarming. And if we don't pay attention to Mother Earth and the life-giving resources it can provide us, but we keep treating the earth like a gold mine, like an extractive resource, we will indeed deplete the mine of resources and we won't be able to grow much food. So they're intimately connected. The really good news is that treating the earth well is great for farmers. It's great for public health. It's great for not just environmental health, but for the quality of the air, the quality of the water. Biggest problem Iowa has environmentally, that sort of clear and present danger annually, is terrible water quality. It's poisoned by runoff and seepage into wells from the over-application of these chemicals. And it's dangerous. It's truly dangerous. So I think there's the damage from our current practices to the ecosystem are part and parcel of the same damages that we're seeing to our health, to the air, to the soil, to the food quality that we get, the actual quality of our diets. A third of diseases in the United States come from the food system. They don't have to. And so it's to all of our benefit to step back from all that. And the good news is that caring for the earth turns out to be great for all of us.
We've been in conversation with Timothy Wise. If you want to know more about him and his work at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, check out the show notes for this episode. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. We invite you to become a financial supporter of Earthkeepers. Please visit our website at www.circlewood.online/Earthkeepers to make a donation that will help expand the reach and frequency of this production. It also helps us immensely when you leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts. And please, share this podcast with anyone you know who seeks to become an agent of change and advocacy for the good of the earth. This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.